Welcome, everybody. Just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the connection. And we have a great conversation set up for today. A little bit first is I'm Loren Fogelman, and I show accounting professionals how to double their income while working half the time. And today's topic is one that I am such a fan on. It's how to take time off and unplug while still growing your firm. And we're going to be speaking with Brannon Poe, but just a little bit is what we're going to really be looking into is if you've been working too long and it's been a while since you've taken time off, or you're continuing to take time off, but even when you do, you're still working on your business because technology can access you anywhere, or you find that it's not possible to grow your firm without sacrificing your personal life, then I suggest have pen and paper ready, because I know Brannon is a wealth of information on that. And we're going to let you know where to find more during the conversation as well about Brannon. But a little bit about him is that Poe Group Advisors was founded by Brannon Poe, CPA, and he's been brokering accounting firms for almost 20 years. He got his start as a CPA at Ernst & Young, and then in 2003, Brannon started facilitating accounting firm sales on the East Coast of the US, and now PGA has helped facilitate hundreds of transactions all over the US and Canada. So the other thing is that he is also the podcast host of Accountant's Flight Plan. So if you are looking on how to be able to buy, sell, or grow your firm, then that is definitely a high value resource to check out. So as you can see, Brannon is a thought leader. He's also the author of several books within the accounting space, creating content that has been published by ACPA and CPA Canada. And you can find out more about the Poe Group Advisors at poegroupadvisors.com. But right now, okay, Brannon, let's just dig in. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that introduction.
Absolutely. And I always like starting off by hearing a little bit about your background and how you found selling to accounting firms and as well as creating the Poe Group Advisors.
Well, how I got into selling firms is a funny, kind of interesting story. So as you mentioned, I was a CPA at E&Y, and I was on the audit side, and I went to work for a regional firm here called Elliott Davis and Company, which is pretty big on the East Coast. And I just didn't, I liked public accounting, but I didn't like a lot of, I guess I didn't like the lack of interaction that I had at that level. And so I left public practice and I moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and I was at a continuing professional ed event with a friend of mine. And so after the event, we went out and we were shooting pool and just talking. And he said, you know, there's this guy that just sells CPA practices. That's all he sells. You should call him and see if you could buy a practice from him. And so I drive home the next day, because this event was in Columbia, a couple of hours from my house. And I couldn't remember the guy's name that he told me. So I went online and I found the wrong guy. I reached out to a gentleman named Howard Holmes, who was just starting a brokerage business. And he said, you know, I don't have anybody in South Carolina. Would you like to sell CPA firms? And I was like, wow, maybe I would. And I flew to Dallas, Texas, met with Howard, and he signed me up that day. And that's how I started selling firms.
Amazing. So I think that you're one of the exceptions about accounting professionals that love the sales part. So just want to acknowledge that you were part of the exceptional few.
Yes, I recognized that really early on in my career that I didn't like the technical work that much. I really enjoyed talking to people and getting out of the details.
Now, one of the things that I know you've written a few practice management books, but the thing that we have decided was such a hot topic and so necessary is being able to take a vacation, and not just take it, but also being able to unplug while on vacation. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about first, why you feel the downtime is important.
Well, I grew up, so my parents were school teachers, and my mother always had her summers off. My father taught university and usually taught some summer school, but he had a fair amount of time off even with that. And we traveled. We took a camping trip to Europe when I was a kid. We spent 7-8 weeks camping across Europe when I was 12 years old. So I grew up taking time off and being with my family. And I remember one of the first experiences I had at Ernst & Young was, this was back in the early 90s when public accounting was a lot rougher in terms of hours than it is now, and expectation for staff, young staff. And they tried to overschedule my vacation. And I basically said, well, I've already planned this vacation. It's a family vacation. I'm going on this vacation. And so I did. And anyway, I realized that so many people sacrifice that. And they think, I think there's a culture, which is shifting somewhat, but I think that is part of the culture. So it's a work culture, and there's an expectation, especially with cell phones now, and there's a habit of just checking email. And I think it's harder than it's ever been to sort of really take a full unplugged vacation. And I realized, by doing this early on, how many ideas I would get when I wasn't thinking about work. It would just sort of magically pop in your mind when your head was clear. So I realized there was always a value. And then I stumbled across some of the work of Dan Sullivan, who is the founder of Strategic Coach. And I've been a coach since 2009. And they really drove this point home in a big way, that you need to look at time off as not some sort of luxury, some sort of reward for hard work. It's actually different than that. It's a form of rejuvenation. And if you want to invest in your business, rejuvenation is a necessary component of that investment.
And I absolutely agree with you. Actually, one of the similarities is that when I first started moving in this space, my first business coach actually was working with Dan Sullivan also. And because of that, I found that it's about taking charge of your calendar, and that there's ways to strategically set up your calendar in order to build that time off into your workflow so that it doesn't affect your income. So is that something that you've seen for yourself as well, Brannon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really about intention. Mm-hmm. And if you have a high intent, like if you're committed to doing that, you will set up the boundaries and it won't even feel difficult. One of the ways to do that is what I recommend is go ahead and book vacations way ahead of time, right? Like plan it a year in advance and just block it off on your calendar. It's that simple. And go somewhere, pay for the trip, like commit, buy the airfare, put the deposit down in the hotel, commit, it's not that hard. And that's what we talk about. We actually wrote a small book that I think I mentioned to you, the Unplugged Vacation, and we go step by step on how you prepare and how you make it a reality.
And I absolutely agree with you. If it's not on the calendar, then it's an intention. It's not actually an action step. So we need to build it into our calendars. And what are some of the things that you've been seeing in the industry with firm owners, where aside from their cell phone, but maybe the mindset part that keeps them possibly tied to their business and actually interferes with their success? Any insights about that, Brannon?
Well, one of the things I noticed in selling firms was that, and I was always interested in what made a firm successful when we were going to market. And, we have the privilege of talking with a lot of CPAs, and we actually get to see their financial statements. So we're seeing how well they're doing. And I remember one particular client who had a very successful firm. His margins were very high. His owner cash flow was very high. And he told me he was taking a 4-week trip and that he was going to be gone and he wasn't going to be checking email while he was gone. And I just immediately, this was a long time ago. This was probably 2004, 2005. So I'd only been selling firms for a couple of years. And he said, I said, how do you do that? And he said, well, you just do it. And the first time you do it, I remember the first time I did it, I was taking off in the airplane. I was looking down over my city, wondering if I was going to have a business when I got back. And he said, now my wife and I, we take a trip like that every year. So we decide somewhere we want to go. They've been to Egypt. They had been to Egypt and saw the pyramids. They had been really traveled all over the world. And it was something they looked forward to every year. And so that was one of the big ahas for me, is not only was this client able to do that, but this client, it did not interfere with his success. He had one of the most successful firms I had seen at that point, in terms of margins and that. And then I saw the pattern. Once I had seen that, I noticed that the practice owners who seemed to have the most successful firms also had the most time off. Now that's not entirely 100% the case. There are workaholics that have very successful firms. However, I would say often is the case is they've paid a heavy price for that on their personal life.
I think you can do a dissertation around something like that. Practice owners having time off are more successful, but I'm thinking that there's a way that they approach growing their firms that's probably different than the ones that remain tied to their firms. So is there anything that you maybe noticed around how they set their firms up that allowed them to take that time off? It's perspective.
It's perspective, because when you zoom out and when you detach from your business, you're able to think about it in a more zoomed out fashion. And what ultimately makes a person successful or not is being able to focus on priorities and being able to decide what's important and what's not important. And I think the detachment helps them have that more detached perspective. And so that way, when they come back to their firm after being off, they're much more strategic about what needs to happen. It also is a natural stress tester, right? So if you extract yourself from your business for a month, how does it run while you're gone? How does your team handle things? How do your clients react? So a lot of information comes just from stress testing in absence like that too. So there's a lot of strategic advantages by taking yourself out of the firm for a little bit.
And one of the things that you're talking about is definitely the prioritizing what's important, what's not important. And a lot of the people that are listening right now might be actually solo firm owners as opposed to having a team that they can delegate to. And I simply want to say that what you're sharing still applies to solo firm owners. It might be that you have to look at some things a little bit differently in order to allow this to happen. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think there's no reason a solo owner couldn't do the same thing. I think, I guess the only maybe exception is like people who are tied in with payroll and don't have someone to help cover payroll. but barring that, even then, if you have a payroll company, find someone else that can cover for you when you're gone or out. Like that's not an impossible task, not an easy task, but not impossible.
Mhm.
But there's absolutely times of the year when you could extract yourself from your solo practice. If there's not, then guess what? You need to take a hard look at what you're doing and think about what you're doing. And maybe it's time for a big strategic shift.
Absolutely. And one of the things just in general is that the accounting practice is changing the course of direction because of technology and people being able to have more options as to how to be able to manage their financials as far as their businesses go. What do you see as some of the challenges that firm owners are currently facing regarding changes in the practice and how they're really setting up their firms?
I think staffing, I'm hearing that is a big challenge that people want to hire. Everyone's having difficulty finding good quality staff. I think really that's driving a lot of the tech changes. And I used to think that the tech changes were going to be the big drivers of change in the profession. But I think the staffing constraints are actually forcing the changes about, which technology is a natural way to kind of help fill that gap with efficiency gains in that. I feel like that's really going to drive a lot of change in the industry is the staffing challenges. I'm already seeing, because like, let's say you're gearing up for tax season and you lose a key staff member. I mean, I have heard a lot of people have had that happen, and now it's really challenging because it's hard to replace that person, right? So what if you can't replace that person? What if you literally just have to make do with what you have in terms of capacity? Well, a lot of people are looking at pricing and they're going, wait a minute, maybe we need to have fewer clients. Well, what if we try to prune our client list with pricing strategies? Well, what's interesting about that, and you've probably seen this, is people think they're going to price people out and they don't. I had a client that doubled his fees thinking he would lose a substantial number of clients. 7%. He lost 7% of his clients with a doubling of fees. And so I'm hearing just some anecdotal things that I'm hearing. I had a client here in South Carolina. They had a personal tax client, just a 1040 client, left the firm, went and basically talked to a regional firm, and they quoted him a $2,500 minimum to do a basic 1040. And so I'm seeing that, hearing that on a regular basis, that the quotes of minimum fees for 1040s is definitely getting raised quite substantially by some of the larger firms. So there's a lot of pricing opportunity for everyone in the industry.
I think that you're bringing up a really important point, is that you can, and I was just talking about this with my group of accounting professionals this morning, actually, is you can have the low rate and do the Walmart factory style type of accounting firm and grow that way. Or you can go more for the higher end, where you're able to really focus on the quality of the relationship and being able to work more closely with your clients and actually even know who your clients are. You don't need as many of them to be able to meet your revenue goals, but it means moving more into the advisory part of it in order to be able to add that extra value and justify your fees. Any thoughts about what you've seen with the advisory part and how that may be shifts the trajectory of a firm?
For sure. What I see with more established firms is their biggest challenge is capacity. They don't have capacity. So to go to them and say, hey, have you thought about doing more tax planning and advisory work? They're like, yeah, sure. I'd love to do that, but I don't have the time. So the first thing I think in looking at doing advisory is, do you have the capacity? Do you really have the capacity to roll out additional services? And if you do, yeah, I don't know if you've read any of Ron Baker's work, but the whole packaged pricing, we see firms rolling that out with huge success. It really increases their revenue. It increases the quality of those relationships with clients. And for me, I don't think the advisory is as complicated as most accountants think it is. Because in some ways, I think a lot of firm owners don't value what they understand about these businesses from the financial perspective. And the things that you see when you're reviewing a client's financial statements, you just take those things for granted. Whereas if you sat down with a client and had a conversation about the things that you notice on a set of financials, you might be surprised that they haven't thought about it that way, or they haven't noticed, or they haven't taken the time to really notice and think about it. I'm involved with Entrepreneurs Organization, EO, and I don't know if you're familiar, for your audience that may not be familiar. So EO has 16,000 members worldwide, and they're all business owners, and they're all grossing at least $1 million a year. All sorts of different industries. So what is shocking to me is when I first got involved with EO and talked with some of the other people in the chapter, which is in Charleston, South Carolina, our local chapter, people are thinking that their CPA is going to give them great advice. And what they're finding is most of the time, all they're getting is a tax return, and they're not getting any advice. And there's this perception that they should be getting it. And I feel like there's high demand for it, and it's a demand that is not being met.
And I've also seen a lot of firms where they give it away for free because they don't understand that might actually be the highest value.
Right.
So one other question that was coming up for me about the unplugging is, because you're involved with the buying and selling of accounting firms, do you feel that accounting firms where the owner is able to unplug actually have more value than firms where the owner is still entrenched in the day-to-day operations?
Yes, and buyers are paying more and more attention to just how dependent the business is on the owner. They're paying, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we'd have a practice for sale and the owner was working 3,000 hours a year, and buyers wouldn't even really, they might question it, but they wouldn't walk away from a deal because of that. Nowadays, people will just walk away. They're just like, yeah, I'm not interested in that. The owner works too much.
So I'm going to shift it back around to the unplugging part of it a little bit more. So what do you do to unplug? Like, where do you go? How much time off do you take, Brannon?
So I take, with weekends, probably around 150 days a year. So weekends, that's 104. So 46 days off, which is 8-9 weeks. I usually take a couple of staycations. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, so I might take a 4-day weekend just locally. Sometimes we go to places like the Caribbean. I've been to Europe. Mexico, Costa Rica.
Mhm.
So we've traveled quite a bit.
Excellent. We can swap travel stories another time, but it's actually built into my contract with my clients that I take a sabbatical month every year in December. And when we create packages together, we actually do that for them with their firm and their practice as well, so that their clients know that this month off, whatever month it is that they choose, is going to be where they're not going to have any direct contact. So definitely are on the same page. And just want to know, what is a piece of advice that you might have to someone starting a new practice or is getting ready to acquire one?
Well, I think the key is prioritization. And I go back to this, it's being focused on what's important. And accountants are notorious for, well, you think about it, it's like accounting is a very detailed profession. So accountants tend to like detail. But when you're running a business, if everything is important, then nothing is important.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to prioritize and focus. So the things that really drive the business, there may be a handful of things that really drive the business. And that's what you need to put your time and energy into.
Excellent. And the other part that I wanted to say is, if people wanted to reach out to you, what is the best way for them to do that and follow up?
The best way is to go to our website, poegroupadvisors.com. You can also email me at bpoe@poegroupadvisors.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. That's probably the most, that's probably the social network I frequent the most.
Excellent. And I just want to say, if there is someone who is thinking about selling the firm or acquiring that, then please go ahead and reach out to Brannon. Once again, his website is poegroupadvisors.com. And Brannon, thank you so much for the engaging conversation today. I fully appreciate you sharing how to be able to unplug while still growing your firm.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, we'll have to do this again, Loren.
Absolutely. This is Loren Fogelman with Business Success Solutions, showing accounting professionals how to double their revenue while being able to work half the time. Until next time, take care.